Hello and welcome. My name is Reverend Philip Schenker, and this is our introductory lecture series on the divine principle. In our earlier presentations, we covered a vast number of topics and thousands of years of human history, beginning from the clear blueprint of the principle of creation, God's purpose for human beings and the whole of creation. Then through a deep insight into the human fall, how the contradiction arose in human beings, and the tradition of false love that's been passed on to successive generations. Based on these perspectives, we began to look at the process and providence of restoration in history, how a loving, wise, and almighty God has worked to restore his original ideal and fulfill his purpose of creation, working in and through the events of human history, not by manipulating and controlling events and outcomes, but through the providence of restoration. We saw the integral role of human responsibility in the same way as our first human ancestors disobeyed God's commandment. Likewise, when God calls a chosen central figure in history and raises that person to fulfill a particular responsibility, if that chosen person or family or nation accomplishes their responsibility, then God's will is achieved and history moves closer to the fulfillment of the purpose of creation. However, when the chosen central figure falls short or fails, God's will is frustrated, history prolonged, and God must work to rebuild the foundation and call another central person in a later age to accomplish the same responsibility. Thus, we can see parallel periods in the providence of restoration, which we've been looking at. In our last presentation, for example, we saw clear parallels between the 2,000-year history of Israel preparing for the coming of Jesus, which ended with the tragic rejection by the very people who'd been longing for the Messiah. And Jesus went to the cross, claimed spiritual victory, brought spiritual salvation. And the parallels between that period and the 2,000 years of Christian history since Jesus in preparation for Christ's return. Now, today we're going to focus in on the last 400 years of this 2,000-year providence of Christianity and look at the final preparation period for the second advent of the Messiah. Now, since Christianity has the central responsibility to prepare the foundation for Christ's return, then we've been looking at that particular history, and particularly in recent years in European and later American history. Now, particularly today, we're going to be looking at ideological perspectives and philosophies and religious interpretations and their connection with economic and political and social events in the history of Christian civilization, primarily in Europe. For those of you unfamiliar with these topics or this history, I urge you not to be bored or disinterested, but rather consider this an introduction to these histories that still can provide for us new insight into the parallels, the process, and the providence of restoration. So let's begin. We're going to discuss the period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah. As I mentioned in our earlier presentation, we looked at the 2,000-year period of Israelite history in preparation for Jesus and how it paralleled the 2,000 years of Christian history leading up to our time. The Old Testament age consisted of 400 years of slavery in Egypt, 400 years of tribal leadership under the judges, 120 years of a united kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon, followed by 400 years of divided kingdoms of north and south, then a 210-year period of Babylonian captivity, exile, and return, then beginning from Malachi, Ezra, and Nehemiah, the final 400-year period leading up to the coming of Jesus. Likewise, in the Christian era, we could see striking parallels. The 400 years of persecution in Rome, which culminated in 392 when the emperor of Rome, Theodosius, made Christianity the Roman religion. Then a 400-year period of regional church leadership under the patriarchs, which ended with the crowning of Charlemagne in 800 AD on Christmas Day. Then 119 years of Charlemagne's royal line seeking to build the Holy Roman Empire. When Charlemagne's empire was divided in 919, it began a 400-year period of divided empires, the East and West Franks, and the great schism of Christianity between Roman Catholic and Orthodox. Then a 210-year period of papal exile and return, followed by, beginning from Martin Luther's Reformation, a 400-year period of preparation leading to the threshold of the 20th century, the end of World War I, and the establishment of the communist revolution. So we're going to look at this 400-year period in closer detail and understand its meaning and how God has been working providentially to prepare the foundation for the accomplishment of his purpose of creation through the building of a foundation, global foundation for the Messiah through Christianity. This period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah was the 400-year period from the Protestant Reformation in 1517 until the end of World War I in 1918. Now, with respect to God's providence of restoration, we can divide this era into three distinct periods. First, the period of the Reformation, when two movements arose, both seeking to recapture the traditions of Western civilization. One was a cultural movement, the Renaissance. The other, a more spiritual movement, the Reformation. They worked together to break down the dogmatic control of the medieval church and to undermine the corrupt feudal society of the medieval period. The second period of this 400 years was a period of religious and ideological conflicts, where through these two movements, Renaissance and Reformation, which undermined the dogmatic control of the church, now there was a freedom of thought and interpretations of the Bible, and new philosophies developed reflecting these two movements. And these different ways of looking at life and evaluating what was true inevitably came into conflict. The third period is the period of maturation of politics, economy, and ideology, when these two movements matured into ideological movements that developed hardened political and economic systems. Let's look first at the period of the Reformation, from 1517 to 1648. This 130-year period of the Reformation began in 1517, when Martin Luther initiated the Protestant Reformation in Germany, and it lasted until the wars of religion were settled by the Treaty of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. Let's consider the background that gave rise to this period. When God's providence through medieval society was not fulfilled, and remember that God wanted to realize unity between the kings and the popes during this Christian era. That unity and a united Christian tradition around them would have been a foundation of substance for the Messiah. However, the kings fell into corruption, and ultimately even papal Christianity failed and became corrupt. Therefore, the direction of God's work and providential history shifted to establish anew the foundation for the returning Christ through the Renaissance and Reformation, these two movements. In the late Middle Ages, people's original minds were repressed, their free development blocked by the social environment, the corrupt and oppressive environment of feudalism, and the secularization and corruption of the Roman Church. Medieval Europeans were prompted by the impulses of their innermost hearts to break down their oppressive social environment and open the way for the restoration of their own original nature, to express themselves fully and freely. This was the spirit that gave rise to these movements. Now, as people pursued the recovery of both the internal spiritual aspects and external physical aspects of their original nature, the thought of the age branched out through two specific movements. Now, these two movements both sought to recover the heritage of Western civilization, but we can distinguish them in relative terms as more Abel type and more Cain type. The first movement was the elder brother. It came first. in the 14th century began. This Cain-type movement began as a revival of Hellenism, the ancient classical civilization of Greece. This movement gave rise to the Renaissance. Renaissance is the French word for rebirth, and it was so named because it was considered a rebirth of classic Hellenic civilization. The core value of this movement was humanism, the dignity of man, the beauty of nature, and the happiness of man's life in the world, and pursuit of the good life. The Younger Brother movement, the second movement, which followed this Abel-type movement, began as the revival of the Hebraic heritage of Israel, a search for a more sincere and genuine and righteous faith. This was the Reformation. And seeking for the spirit of the early Christian church, it gave rise to the Protestant Reformation, whose core value was faith in God. Large numbers of Europeans were serfs. They labored 6 days a week for the wealth of their feudal masters and lords. They were pressed into labor from very early in childhood. They worked hard for the sake of others. They owned nothing or very little. They traveled almost nowhere. Most could not read or write. There was little to inspire and free or liberate their original nature. On the seventh day, they worked 6 days a week. On the seventh day, they would enter the church, where they would be told that the reason they suffered on earth was because of sin. And this would be their lot in life, but when they would die, they would go to a better place and experience joy and happiness with Jesus. This was the situation for many. Now, there were others who were artisans or merchants or scholars, etc. And although they might have had a better living situation, they had no freedom of thought, for the medieval church controlled every aspect of belief and process in European civilization. In the meantime, the church leaders were often extremely corrupt. Popes kept armies, ordered assassinations, controlled vast amounts of lands, swindled money, made backroom political deals, had illegitimate children. There was a tremendous problem of corruption within the church. The spiritual tradition founded upon Jesus and the saints is a beautiful and empowering tradition that gave life to Christian people. But the earthly church, once it became wedded to the power of the state in the 4th century, through Constantine and Theodosius and others, it has been constantly vulnerable to corruption and attack and becoming worldly and materialistic. This has been a tremendous problem. The original mind, which desired to be free, has two aspects. There's the inner desire of the original mind, as we've studied, which seeks for piety and faith and duty, and is expressed through religion, a deeper inner life and connection with God. But there are also external desires of our original nature for reason, for rights, for individual value, for understanding life in the world and experiencing a good life in the world and a pleasant environment. These are both aspects of the original nature, and these two desires gave rise to the two movements that we're speaking of, the Renaissance and the Reformation. Now, at the same time, these two movements reflected two historical streams of Western civilization. The Hellenic, based on the civilization of Greece, and the Hebraic, based on the civilization of Judaism. Before we go forward to explain these 400 years, just a word about these two civilizations. The Hebraic civilization of ancient Israel was definitely a God-centered civilization. This humble people, living in a desert homeland, having very little externally, suffered and struggled much and looked toward Almighty God as their deliverer and their hope. With little external development, their inner tradition formed much of their value in life. And they longed for the Messiah who would liberate them. God was a righteous, almighty, and just God. And man's responsibility was to make himself in the image and likeness of God. Truly a more theistic, internal, and God-centered culture. However, the other important aspect of Western civilization that came from Hellenic, Greek civilization was in some ways quite different. The Greeks were more cynical. They were focused less on the other world and the next life and more focused on happiness and fulfillment in this life. Greek gods, if you study Greek mythology, were often jealous and deceitful and rebellious and competitive and manipulating the events on earth through people to fulfill their own selfish goals. In many ways, the Greek image of gods were in the image of fallen people. So as a result, Greek culture focused less on the divine and more on the dignity, beauty, and divinity in man. Greek art idealized the human form and created great beauty. The Olympics also were idealizing the physical capacities of human beings. Greek civilization produced the foremost developments in medicine, in architecture, in political development, in social structure, and in mathematics, and so many aspects of science and technology. It was genuinely a more man-centered, external, and humanistic civilization. These two streams also gave rise to these two movements that led to the last 400 years. Let's take a look. Let's first look at the Renaissance and how it arose. The Renaissance grew out of the external pursuit of man's original nature, reason, and relationship with the external truths of the environment and the world. This movement to revive the ancient heritage of Hellenism caught fire. Renaissance humanism thus rose to prominence. The Renaissance came to life in 14th century Italy, which was the center to study classical Hellenic heritage. Actually, the Crusaders in the Middle Ages had brought back from the Middle East ancient Greek classic art treasures, and this stimulated a movement of culture. It was originally a cultural movement in art, in music, in opera, and focused on the beauty of life in the world and sought to recapture this spirit. Though it began as a movement imitating the thought and life of ancient Greece and Rome, it soon developed into a wider movement to encompass every aspect of society. It created a genuine movement for social and scientific and cultural change. In fact, the Renaissance became the external driving force for the construction of the modern world, the pursuit of the good life, the desire for understanding of our environment, the appreciation of the beauty of nature and the dignity of man and the worth of the individual. All of these gave rise to the political, scientific, technological, and social development that has shaped our modern world, beginning from Western Christian civilization. Now let's look at the Reformation, its companion movement. As medieval Europeans sought to realize the external aspirations of their original nature, they also began to pursue its repressed internal aspirations. The Renaissance had opened the way for reform. There had been earlier efforts to reform the church in the 13th and 14th centuries. Men like John Wycliffe, who challenged the church, which wouldn't allow the Bible to be read by the average parishioner and kept it in traditional remote languages. He translated the Bible, proposed for it to be spread and made available to everyone. Wycliffe was shunned, and 30 years after he died, his body, at the direction of the church, his body was dug up and burned at the stake, and he was excommunicated. Jan Hus, a reformer who followed Wycliffe, also sought to create reform, but was excommunicated and burned at the stake. But now, with the rise of science and the development of the Renaissance, the dogmatic control of the church was now being undermined. Galileo and Copernicus had shown that the earth was round, not flat, that the earth went around the sun and not vice versa. The church, which had opposed this, and with this newfound freedom, the movement for reform could catch on. So the reformers called for the revival of the early spirit of Christianity, when believers zealously lived for the will of God, guided by the words of Jesus and the apostles. The spark that brought this movement was to raise funds to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The Pope began selling indulgences, which church doctrine affirmed would remit the penalty for sin in the next life. In other words, if I made a donation, I would receive a signed document that guaranteed that I or a loved one would have less time suffering in purgatory as a result of my offering. When this indulgence was proclaimed in Germany in 1517, a movement to protest its abuse ignited a fuse which exploded in the Protestant Reformation under the leadership of Martin Luther. Luther had translated the Bible into his native German and made it available. Luther now analyzed 95 points where the church doctrine was going against and contradicting the Scripture. He put these together in his 95 Theses. He tacked them on the door of a church in his native Wittenberg, and he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." As a result, the flames of Reformation grew strong and soon spread to Switzerland and France and England and Scotland and the Netherlands with all of these many other reformers. Now, as Protestantism arose, it was opposed by traditional Catholic powers, churches, and governments. And so wars resulted, and the wars of religion, which swirled around the Protestant movements, continued for more than 100 years until 1648, when the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War. So together, these two movements had worked together. One, a cultural movement, the Renaissance, and another, a spiritual movement. They had worked together to break down the dogmatic control and the corrupt institution of the medieval church and feudal society. Now, both of these movements were reactions against this medieval period. However, you can see that the elder brother, the Renaissance, one of them, was moving away from God, away from the tradition of faith, and searching for the meaning of life in the world and centered on human beings and the good life. Whereas the Reformation was searching for a deeper, truer, more authentic faith and a personal experience with God. Let's continue. The period of religious and ideological conflict is next. This period of religious and ideological conflicts refers to the next 140 years, which began with the secure establishment of Protestantism through the end of the 30 Years' War and ended with the French Revolution in 1789. Now, as modern people continued to pursue through these two movements their internal and external desires